My name is Steve Phinney, and I'm a physician from Northern California. And my background is, my training was in internal medicine. And during my medical school experience and training, I was also using riding a bicycle as a form of stress relief, and became very interested in sports nutrition, figuring out why I didn't feel good if I rode too long. So when I finished my medical training, I went back to school and got a PhD in nutrition, which is a little unusual for physicians, and worked in academic medicine for about 20 years total. And about 15 years ago, got frustrated by the lack of acceptance for the research I'd done on low-carb diets, and moved into consulting and have been doing independent consulting since then. My first interest in low-carb nutrition came from a reverse angle, in that as a cyclist, I realized that if I didn't eat carbohydrates during a long ride, I'd run out of energy and experience what people call hitting the wall, which is running out of carbohydrate fuel. So when the Atkins diet came along in the 1970s, and a lot of people were advocating that for weight loss, I, from my own experience, assumed that it would debilitate people. But I got into some discussions with some of my senior physicians where I was training about that possibility, and we decided we'd do an experiment to actually see. And so we actually did an experiment with untrained people, not highly trained athletes, and had them go on an Atkins-like weight loss diet. And sure enough, after the first week, all of them reported that their energy levels were down and that they really didn't feel like they were able to go out and do it much vigorous in the way of vigorous activity. However, after 6 weeks of the low-carb diet, their energy levels had rebounded. And when we put them on a treadmill and tested them compared to where they'd been at baseline, they actually could do more exercise. Now, of course, they'd lost weight, and anybody who weighs less can exercise. So we made them wear a backpack with the weight they lost in their backpack. And still they were able to exercise longer than before they went on the low-carb diet. So the way I became an advocate of low-carb diet, that was the first step. I've done multiple low-carb studies since then, not just looking at performance, but looking at blood lipid levels, what happens to cholesterol, looking at markers of inflammation and other factors. And since we've determined that all of those go in the right direction towards safety and well-being, beginning probably 12, 14 years ago, I've developed enough information for me as a physician to tell people in complete confidence that if you have, particularly if you have a medical problem associated with insulin resistance, like diabetes or metabolic syndrome, you're much safer being on a low-carb diet than you are following the standard high-carb, low-fat recommendations. And over the years, I've published over 80 papers in the medical literature, which it doesn't make me a star, but it's not an inconsequential body of research, published research. As I mentioned, in terms of my motivation to begin studying this, I set out to prove Dr. Atkins wrong. Now, I did not know him or meet him. At that time, I was at the University of Vermont, which is in the northeastern part of the United States. He was in New York City, so he was probably 300 miles away physically from where I was, but I never met the gentleman. He was a practicing physician. I was an aspiring academic physician. I wanted to be working in a medical school. Again, I set out to prove him wrong. And so there was a little bit of eating crow on my side. If I went to talk to him, I have to say, I thought you were wrong, but now I'm sure you're right. But nonetheless, when I published my first group of papers, there were three papers between 80 and 83 that were published. In the next edition of his book, and he kept doing new editions, updates of his diet book, he very eagerly quoted my research. And I'm told that he went around the office and to people who came to visit them, he handed out photocopies of my papers saying, see here, this proves I'm right. So I think we were bonded in an indirect way, but never at a personal level, in part for me to protect myself, because he was so, as we say, radioactive. He was very outspoken in his advocacy of a ketogenic diet for weight loss. He was also outspoken in his distaste for mainstream medicine for ignoring him. So he was a bit of a polarizing individual, and I mean, I may have been a fool to keep persistent doing research in this area, but I wasn't enough of a fool to be seen hugging Bob Atkins. That would have sealed my fate for sure.